So, as you see, I have a completely different setup right now. No, I do not expect you to make this. I'm just showing this to showcase the concept of a loop. Now, a loop is essentially just a bunch of if statements put together. That's how it would wind up working. So I just have something simple right here. I have a counter. And right now my counter is equal to 0. And when I click this button, it'll tell me the counter. So if I were to start this, my counter is 0. When I click this button, it should show 0. 0. Obviously it works. I keep clicking it, does whatever. So, the easiest way to understand it, if you were to break this down step by step, a loop is just a bunch of if statements inside itself. Now, in theory, this is never ending, but you don't want to do that. You don't ever want to have a loop that never ends, because eventually the computer is just going to keep using up data and using up data and using up data. Eventually, you will use up all the data on your computer if you have a loop that never ends. So, whenever you make a loop, you must make sure that you have some sort of end point. But we're just going to break this down step by step. A loop is essentially if, and then, something happens, then, and we'll end the if, obviously. And that would be a loop of 1. There's just one iteration of it. So if counter equals 0, I'm going to now say, counter equals 1. And now if I were to hit this start button, I now have, counter is 0. If the counter is 0, counter will now equal 1. And it stops. It's just a loop of 1. However, if I were to go inside this, I could then go and add another part. Else if. So else if counter equals 1, then counter equals 2. So now, if I were to do this, start 0, 1, 2, and it stops. We have ourselves a loop that loops twice. And I can just keep doing this and go, if counter equals 3, then if counter equals 2, then counter will equal 3. If counter equals 3, then counter equals 4. If counter equals 4, then counter will equal 5. And then, of course, if I really wanted to, I could just do if counter equals 5, then counter equals 0. I can just have this go back to that. So if I were to start this, I could go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, back to 0. And I could just keep going over and over and over again and keep looping it. That's a loop. It goes back to itself at the beginning. And you see how that happens? See how the logic is going? Now, that's a lot of text to type for simply counting a number. I agree. Now, we're not going to use a bunch of if statements for that. Instead, what we're going to wind up using is going to use a for loop. So for, I'm just going to go counter equals, and I'm going to put 0 to 5. And you see it already, and I hit enter and it already did the next in me. So, for counter equals 0 to 5. I'm just going to put counter equals counter plus 1. Now, you might be able to get away with a counter plus plus, because that's generally what that means, but right now it's going, oh, that didn't work, must be in parentheses. So, obviously that's not how it would work. And in theory, this should be telling us our counter since we're tapping on a click button, so let's see what happens here. So, start. Oh, and it already went all the way to 6 there on me. It already made its way to the end of the thing. It went from 0 to 6, 0 to 5, counter equals counter plus 1. It did the entire loop, step by step, instantly. So, it did all the logic, it went to its ending point, it started from 0 and went to 5. And of course, counter equals counter plus 1. So, we could do that, or we could do something where we make ourselves an error. So for example, we could have, so we're going to use counter as our counter. We have our starting point, we have an ending point. So from 0 to, let's go to -5, counter equals counter plus 1. Now, this is going to give me an error. Why? Because I'm doing counter is equal to counter plus 1. So counter is starting at 0 and it's going to -5. But tell me, if we're adding a number from 0, we'll go +1, +2, +3, +4. We will never hit -5 as our ending point. So if the machine is smart, it'll stop me from doing this right now and then. And let's see if it'll do it. Yeah, it's saying 0, it can't do it, it's never going to work. So, you see, but still, by the way, this is just, what, 3 lines of code compared to what it was in the if statements? So yeah, essentially, these 3 lines are all those nested ifs done instantaneously, done in one blink of an eye. Much easier to understand this loop than it would be to type out every single if statement. But I have to show you the if statements so that you understand what's happening behind the scenes of this for loop.